Affairs, I call James Cleverly to answer the substantive question number 1 from Michael Fabricant. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have long condemned Iran's regional destabilising activity, including its political, financial and military support to militant and proscribed groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, and militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is, in its entirety, subject to UK's autonomous sanctions. On the 18th of February, the Foreign Secretary, alongside his E3 and US counterparts, committed in a statement to working with regional parties to address their security concerns. We continue to support the security of our partners, working to end the conflict in Yemen and strengthen institutions in Iraq and Lebanon.
Let's head up to Lichfield with Michael Fabricant. Michael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend, the Minister, will know, it's not just activity in the Middle East that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is responsible for. It's not just with Hezbollah. There have been incidents in France and other parts of Europe, and it's caused the United States to ban the Republican Guard and make them a terror organisation. When will the United Kingdom do the same and designate them as a terrorist organisation?
Mr. Speaker, we keep a list of proscribed organisations under review, and as my honourable friend knows, we do not routinely comment on whether organisations or individuals are under consideration for a prescription. But as I say, the IRGC is in its entirety subject to our autonomous sanctions regime. The UK, along with our European partners, wholeheartedly condemned the bomb plot that he makes reference to in Paris in 2018 and in 2019.
Shreberley.
It's number 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in Cameroon's Anglophone region remains deeply concerning. We continue to call for an end to all violence and restart an inclusive dialogue that addresses the root cause of the crisis. When I spoke to Prime Minister Ngote in December, I reiterated the UK's commitment to supporting a peaceful resolution on this issue.
The situation in southern Cameroon is indeed deeply concerning. What's happening there to the Anglophone minorities, some 5 million, is terrible. There are numerous human rights abuses. The Francophone president, a corrupt dictator, has been in power since 1982 and is refusing to devolve any power at all to the English-speaking minority. So will the government now act? Will the Foreign Secretary at the highest level take it up with our French allies? They have enormous influence in Francophone Africa. And will the Minister for Africa do the equivalent of old gunboat diplomacy in our soft power age and himself visit southern Cameroons and take this issue up and try and help our English-speaking friends who we betrayed back in 1962?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. I certainly will visit Cameroon at the earliest possible opportunity, but can reassure him that we've worked very closely with our French and American partners alongside other partners. We also do an awful lot of work through this House and through the member for Lagan Valley in bringing peace to that region and sharing experiences. So I thank him for his interest and certainly will commit further activity and a visit in due course.
Please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I'll answer questions 3, 4 and 5 together. The Minister for South Asia, Lord Ahmed, set out our serious concerns about human rights in Sri Lanka in a statement at the UN Human Rights Council on the 25th of February. On the 22nd of February, the Foreign Secretary confirmed the UK would lead a new resolution on post-conflict reconciliation, accountability and human rights. Now, we continue to engage with Sri Lanka on these issues and on climate change, trade and the COVID-19 response. And UK-funded programmes in Sri Lanka support peace building, resettlement, police reform and demining.
Mr. Speaker, for decades the UK has provided extensive military and police support to the Sri Lankan police and military, and this support has continued despite deeply troubling reports of widespread use of torture by the Sri Lankan police, including the use of the death penalty now on drugs charges. And can the Minister please explain, Mr. Speaker, why the UK has spent more than £7 million through its few-year Conflict Stability and Security Fund programme to assist the Sri Lankan police and military? And more importantly, will he commit to publishing the full OSJA assessments for activities under this programme to reassure this House the UK is not contributing to serious human rights violations?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the honourable member, who I know takes a very keen interest in Sri Lanka, I would just say our engagement with the military in Sri Lanka is designed to support the development of a modern and effective and a human rights compliant military. Engagement with the police is focused on community policing, increasing women's representation, improving responses to sexual and gender-based violence. And our engagement is subject to ongoing overseas security and justice assistance assessments, as he refers to ensure that it supports UK values and is consistent with human rights obligations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Many of my Slough constituents, especially those worshipping at the Masjid al-Jannah, were extremely distressed by the alarming reports of forced cremations of Sri Lankan coronavirus victims, including Muslims and Christians for whom burial rites and traditions are sacred. So, as the country hopefully progresses with truth, justice and reconciliation after its devastating civil war, what representations has the Minister made to his Sri Lankan counterpart for the respect and protection of everyone's religious beliefs and freedoms?
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this. I know this is of great concern to his constituents and to many other honourable members' constituents. My colleague Lord Ahmed, who is the Minister responsible for Sri Lanka, has raised the important issue of not just of human rights and accountability and reconciliation with his counterpart, the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister and the High Commissioner, but he also has deep concerns about the decision to mandate cremations for those deceased due to COVID. The United Kingdom has shared guidance on how burials can happen within WHO guidelines to the Sri Lankan authorities.
We go to Fleur Anderson. Fleur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With reference to the expiry of the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 40/1 this month, what success has the government had in its role as leader of the core group on Sri Lanka at the UNHCR in drafting a new UN Human Rights Council resolution that secures international support and reflects the 8 areas of focus set out by the UNHCR High Commissioner's recent report?
I'll thank the Honourable Lady for her question. We are very concerned by the recent UN report on human rights and accountability in Sri Lanka. As I've said in a previous answer, we've made our concerns about human rights situation clear. The Foreign Secretary has confirmed the United Kingdom would lead a new resolution on post-conflict reconciliation, accountability and human rights.
The substantive question to the Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK will use its G7 presidency this year to advance equitable access to safe and effective vaccines through widespread international cooperation.
Let's head to Stafford with Theo Clark. Theo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having visited the Kingston Vaccination Centre recently, I've seen firsthand the fantastic work our healthcare workers are doing to vaccinate my Stafford constituents. But in order to fully defeat COVID-19, we must vaccinate people around the world. And during my virtual visit to Kenya last week, there was much excited about the upcoming delivery of some COVID-19 vaccines. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is essential that we not only allow countries to access our surplus capacity via COVAX, but that we also donate vaccines to the poorest countries in the world?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend for the great work she's doing locally, but also raising the issue of the international access to the vaccine. She will know The UK has contributed £548 million to COVAX AMC, which is the international mechanism. That will secure over 1 billion doses. And I can also tell her, in relation to her virtual Kenya visit, that the rollout of the first deliveries under COVAX has now begun in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And by the end of June, in 92 of those poorer countries, we want to see all the vulnerable receiving their vaccines. That's Global Britain as a force for good.
We now have Shadow Minister Ignited.
Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the news that the Foreign Secretary just outlined there about the COVAX deliveries in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. It's excellent news. And tragically, we've seen 50,000 deaths alone in South Africa from COVID-19. But we've also seen 409,000 deaths from malaria, 700,000 deaths from AIDS-related causes, 1.8 million estimated could die from TB in 2020, and there are Ebola outbreaks, as the Foreign Secretary will be aware, in Africa at the moment. Vaccines, whether for COVID or other treatments for those other diseases, only work when they also have strong public health systems, the nurses, doctors, cold chain, diagnostic capacity and health systems to deliver them. We've got a moral duty to do our fair share, and it's in our global and common interest. So can the Foreign Secretary say, will he be maintaining our overall bilateral health and our multilateral health spending, or will it be cut?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? He's absolutely right to pay tribute to the work that the UK has done internationally, not just on COVAX and the vaccine for this pandemic, but on TB, on malaria, on polio, in a whole range of other areas. We have had to make the difficult decision on 0.7%, which you'll be aware of, and we've been very clear, the allocations will of course be published in due course, but very clear that public health is the #1 priority to be safeguarded across the piece.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has announced targeted measures on the 12th of January to help ensure no British organisations are complicit in the gross human rights violations occurring in Xinjiang. The United Kingdom continues to lead international action, including at the UN, to hold China to account. The Foreign Secretary made a robust intervention at the Human Rights Council on the 22nd of February, calling out the systematic violation of the rights of people in Hong Kong and pressing China for unfettered access to Xinjiang for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Let's head up to Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ahead of the International Women's Day, I'd like to take the opportunity to highlight the recent report by the BBC, which highlighted the extensive use of sexual violence in Xinjiang. I'm sure the Minister will agree the report was incredibly troubling and details what can only be described as torture and abuse of human rights and dignity. Could the Minister then explain why it is taking the government so long to sanction Chinese officials? And in light of the recent Magnitsky sanctions in the case Myanmar, can he explain why they have yet to be used in the case of Xinjiang?
Again, the Honourable Gentleman takes a very keen interest in this subject, and I appreciate all the work he does on it. We are carefully considering further designations under our human rights sanctions regime, but he will appreciate that it's not appropriate to speculate on who may be designated in the future, as to do so, Mr. Speaker, could reduce the impact of such sanctions.
I've agreed with the Minister to separate the two, so we've got a substantive question from Jamie Stone. If the Minister answers, then I'll go to him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross will no doubt have heard the Prime Minister's view, who highlighted that we are not normally in favour of sporting boycotts. Along with this, participation of the national team at the Winter Olympics is a matter for the British Olympic Association. They are required to operate independently of the government under IOC regulations.
Let's go and see Jamie Stone. Jamie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am indeed aware of what the Prime Minister has said. Nevertheless, our allies, such as the United States and Canada, have referred to what's going on in Xinjiang province as genocide. I wonder if the Minister can agree two things with me. Firstly, that we should absolutely get international condemnation of these ghastly goings-on in China. And secondly, I wonder, in view of what the Prime Minister said, will the Minister agree with me that we should support those athletes who choose themselves individually to boycott the Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games as a demonstration of their opposition to this genocide?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I would say to the honourable gentleman is we are leading international action on this, including at the UN, to hold China to account. We have led from the front. We've got an increasing cohort of countries who are supporting our statements as to the happenings in Xinjiang. What I will say is this is a matter for the British Olympic Association and the individual sportsmen. They are absolutely required to operate independently of government, and rightly so, under the regulations set down by the International Olympic Committee. But that is indeed a matter for the Olympic organisations and the individual sportsmen.
Let's head to SNP spokesperson Alan Smith. Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The malfeasance of the Chinese government in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong are well documented, and my party supports the offer that's been made to the 5 million Hong Kong citizens of a route to citizenship. But I would be grateful for an assurance from the Minister that proper preparations and proper funding for the integration of Hong Kongers coming to the UK are actually in place, because I'm not convinced they are. We can't let this scheme just be a first-class lifeboat for the rich of Hong Kong. It does need to be properly run through for everybody. Can he commit to a statement to the House in due course explaining how the scheme is being worked through with the Home Office and that proper funding has been allocated to make sure this is open to all Hong Kongers?
Minister.
It's a very, very sensible question from the honourable gentleman. It's absolutely the case that we need to ensure that those BNO passport holders who arrive in the UK are treated and greeted well. We do welcome the many applications that we have had thus far. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has met with the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government to discuss exactly the issue the honourable gentleman raises. It's important that people are given the right support when they arrive in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure further information on such schemes and what has been organised for these people coming from Hong Kong will be announced very shortly.
We have a substantive question to Minister Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I visited Iraq and the Kurdistan region of Iraq in December of last year, meeting with Iraq's Prime Minister Kadhimi and the Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Prime Minister Barzani. Recent attacks on coalition forces and civilians in Erbil is unacceptable. The UK stands fully behind Iraq and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. We welcome the Iraqi investigation to hold the perpetrators to account, and the UK encourages cooperation between Baghdad and Erbil to agree a sustainable budget, something I discussed with both the Iraqi Finance Minister and Prime Minister Barzani on that visit in December.
Right, let's go to Robert Holford. Robert. Oh, right. Right, let us move on. We've got a substantive question to Minister Dudridge.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer question 13, 14 and 15 together. The government remains firmly committed to helping the world's poorest people. Our budget will continue to serve the primary aim of reducing poverty in developing countries, including in the global south.
Right, let's head down to Gerald Jones. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has made the appalling decision to slash life-saving support to the world's poorest and most vulnerable people in the middle of a pandemic, and an equally appalling announcement yesterday with regards to Yemen, highlighting a blatant disregard to fulfil its moral duty. So will the Minister and the Foreign Secretary press upon the Chancellor to use this week's budget to rebuild Britain's proud position as a country which supports those in need by reversing his decision to make the UK the only G7 nation to cut its aid budget?
Minister.
I'm sorry the honourable gentleman thinks that £10 billion is a small sum of money. He mentions Yemen. We should be proud that since the start of that conflict we've contributed £1 billion and at the pledging conference yesterday a further 87 million. That's activity from this government and we are proud of that activity.
Let's head to Martin Day. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's reported that cuts announced to the international aid spending will not come in until after the G7 summit. This merely delays rather than avoids humiliation on the world stage, while the absence of a timetable for when the cuts will take place leaves charities trying to plan ahead in limbo. Does the Minister agree that this unsustainable position will be detrimental to project outcomes, and would it not be preferable to reverse this shameful decision now?
I just don't recognise the timescale which he speaks of, and we work with partners on an ongoing basis around the delivery of programmes and will continue to do so. That's what I do on a daily basis amongst other ministers.
Let's head to Jeff Smith. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain holds the pen on Yemen. We're the senior country. Isn't it our duty to lead by example? And isn't cutting aid by 60% at a time of acute humanitarian crisis a terrible example? The UN Secretary General said reducing aid was a death sentence. Is he wrong?
Yes, sir.
Well, Mr. Speaker, another person that doesn't think £1 billion is a lot of money. His constituents, I think, well, £87 million is a lot of money. And we are doing exactly what he's saying, and we are standing up. This is actually the 5th largest pledge to Yemen. He should be proud of that, not attacking it.
Right, let's go to SNP spokesperson Chris Law. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm hearing a lot of bluff and bluster there. This government is pressing ahead with the most deep and devastating cuts to the budget at the worst possible time, and in doing so is reneging on the UK's commitment to spending 0.7 of GNI on aid which is enshrined in law. Mr. Speaker, when I asked the Foreign Secretary about this, he said, and I quote, "We want to respect that legislation and we will. However, with press reports speculating that cuts will take place from April, the legislation will not be amended until July, will the Foreign Secretary refuse to implement cuts before legislation is passed? And will he resign if he breaks the law? Yes or no?"
Mr.
Well, as the Foreign Secretary said before, we'll look very carefully at what's required by the law, but the law envisages 0.7% target potentially not being met in any given year in the light of specifically of the fiscal and economic circumstances, and we will abide by that law, and legislation also furthermore allows for us to report to Parliament about what we are doing, so we will stick to that.
Let's head to Sarah Champion, Chair of the Select Committee. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was ashamed yesterday when this government more than halved its contribution to the humanitarian support of Yemen, the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet. I really hope that this is not the global Britain that we want to see. So can I ask the Minister what consultation he has had with the NGOs, recipients and partners in the Global South to minimise the impact of changes to the UK aid budget? And when will the government publish its forthcoming country allocations for ODA spending?
The process the Honourable Lady mentions, we're in the middle of. Decisions on publication have not yet been met. Our focus has been looking at country plans and the programmes centrally, doing that through countries, and by extension part of that will be looking through delivery partners, including the NGOs that play an excellent work. So actually engaging as early as possible with them, both through embassies where a lot of this relationship is devolved to, is absolutely essential, and we remain committed to doing that.
Question 17, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I'll take questions 17 to 22. Over the last 5 years, UK aid has helped 8 million girls get a decent education, and as the House knows, our global ambition is to make sure that 40 million girls have 12 years of quality education by 2026.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge, which serves as a reminder to us all to challenge and call out gender bias and inequality where we see it. According to UNICEF, only 66% of countries have achieved gender parity in primary education, falling to only 25% by upper secondary education. Can the Minister reassure me that he will not only continue working with his international counterparts to ensure that girls do not fall further behind as a result of the pandemic, but also that he will continue his vital work to break down the very real barriers to girls' education going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend? Can I reassure her not only have we got a target of 40 million girls getting 12 years education, we also want to see 20 million girls become literate by the age of 10. We'll be co-hosting with Kenya a major summit in July of this year to progress those goals, and I was out and had just one chance in Addis Ababa in January to visit the Yekam Mizrak Chora School, which showed me firsthand the incredible difference that our aid budget makes.
I said to Karen Bradley. Karen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome what the Foreign Secretary has said regarding the UK's commitment to ensuring education for girls. There is no doubt that the UK has world leadership in this issue, as we do with modern slavery, preventing gender-based violence. And of course, it was the UK that worked to help stop Ebola becoming a global pandemic. So could the Foreign Secretary confirm not just his commitment to this area, but also his commitment that overseas development spending will continue to be maintained on these very important issues?
Can I thank my right honourable friend? She's absolutely right about the importance of this. As we go through the difficult financial situation we face, we've been very clear girls' education is a top priority to safeguard. And on top of the money we're putting in, on top of the convening power that we're exercising with our the joint summit that we're hosting with Kenya, the Prime Minister has also appointed my honourable friend, the member for Maidstone and Weald, as the Special Envoy on girls' education.
Let's head to Caroline Noakes. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister for making educating girls a foreign policy priority. And as host of the G7, we have a critical opportunity to encourage others to do the same. Can my right honourable friend tell me how much ODA spending he will commit to girls' education this year to make sure our manifesto commitment of ensuring every girl gets 12 years of quality education has the funding that it needs?
Can I thank my right honourable friend and just reassure her, first of all, that the money is being safeguarded. Of course, it is published in the normal way through the formal channels in the autumn, but we are, through the appointment of the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, through the convening power that I've described, and she's quite right to say also through our presidency of the G7, making sure that this is at the very top of the international agenda.
Let's go to Preet Kaur Gill, where there's two questions for the Shadow Minister. Preet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British people have a proud history of stepping up and supporting those in need, but the actions of this government yesterday betrayed hundreds of thousands of Yemeni children as he chose to leave them to starve. In November, the Foreign Secretary told this House that humanitarian crisis were one of his priorities, yet he has cut funding to the largest humanitarian crisis in the world by 60%. Clearly, the Foreign Secretary's commitments are worthless. Does he agree that his government's actions have shown our allies and our detractors that his word cannot be trusted?
Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady, although the obvious point to make is that under the last Labour government, they never hit 0.7%, they only hit 0.5% twice, and over the last 5 years in relation to Yemen, including for 2021, we've been between the third and fifth highest donors. We will keep up that effort. We've provided more than £1 billion of funding to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen since the conflict began. And of course, we fully support Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy's efforts to find peace there.
Return to Preet Kaur Gill.
Leading a hasty retreat from the world stage while others are stepping forward. We are the only G7 nation to cut aid. The United States has added billions to the development budget, and France have committed to increasing their support for the world's poorest by reaching 0.7% by 2025. The government can't keep pretending that it can make cuts without risking millions of lives. So will the Foreign Secretary immediately publish all of the details of the cuts made in 2020 and those projected for 2021? And can he also explain to the House what his priorities are? Because clearly it is not preventing hundreds of thousands of Yemenis from going hungry and starving to death.
Secretary.
Thank the Honourable Lady. Of course, The allocations are published in the normal way, as I've just described, formally in the autumn. In fact, the new UK aid pledge of £87 million, which she so blithely dismisses, will feed an additional 240,000 of the most vulnerable Yemenis every month. It will support 400 health clinics and provide clean water for 1.6 million people. We're doing our bit. Of course, these are very difficult financial circumstances. We remain, as we have done over the last 5 years, between the third and fifth highest donor into Yemen.
I said to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugundar. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's commitment to women and girls' education. Does he agree with me, however, that female genital mutilation, which affects, sadly, so many girls across the world, is one of the great hindrances to the education of girls in many parts of the world, including, sadly, in Nigeria? Now, I'm sure he joins with me in welcoming the release of the girls from Zamfara state only the other day. But will he also raise with the Nigerian government, when he has the next opportunity to do so, the likelihood that some 14 million, that's 14 million girls, are likely to go through female genital mutilation between now and 2030. This is a crime, it is a sin, and it is against all justice.
Thank my honourable friend, the Chairman of the Select Committee. Can I join with him in welcoming the release of those young girls who were kidnapped, which I'm sure came as a huge relief to the whole House. He raises in a passionate way the issue of FGM. We've been leaders in calling this out, but also trying to work with governments around the world, in particular in Africa, to try and bring an end to this appalling practice. We'll continue to do so in Nigeria and elsewhere.
Substantive question to Minister Clement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom provides legal aid to vulnerable Palestinian communities at threat of demolition. In 96% of cases, those receiving UK-funded legal support have remained in their homes. The UK ambassador joined ambassadors of European states to urge the government of Israel to cease demolitions in a meeting. He did so in a meeting with the Israeli authorities on the 25th of February, and at the United Nations Security Council on 26th of February, the UK permanent representative called on Israel to end demolitions of Palestinian homes and allow delivery of emergency humanitarian aid.
I said to Julia Elliott. Julia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, like many colleagues, have heard repeated stories from Palestinians facing forced eviction, dispossession and their homes demolished in areas like Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan and Essaouira in occupied East Jerusalem. I and many other people see this as a deliberate attempt to re-engineer the demographic makeup of occupied East Jerusalem. What more can this government do rather than just urge the Israeli government to stop this? What more can the British government do to bring an end to this unacceptable situation?
The United Kingdom has a close and productive working relationship with Israel, and when we speak, the Israelis absolutely do listen. So whilst the Honourable Lady dismisses our urgings, I would remind her that the UK's voice has had an influence in the decisions made by the government of Israel. We will continue to engage, as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, did very recently with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, and the Israeli ambassador to the Court of St James only last month.
We now come to Sir Rutherford.
Question 24, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 24 and 25 together. The UK is actively encouraging both parties back to dialogue. As I just mentioned, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, met with his opposite number on the 10th of February, and I spoke to the Palestinian head of mission here in the UK on the 2nd of February. The UK has been working with both the Government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, alongside the United States and key international partners, to progress specific areas of cooperation, including water and gas provision, energy infrastructure, trade facilitation. We're also seeking to re-establish formal Israeli-Palestinian mechanisms, such as the Joint Economic Committee and its relevant subcommittees.
Thank you. The International Criminal Court's controversial determination on jurisdiction relating to Israel and the Palestinians not only undermines the Middle East peace process, but also heightens the exposure of our armed forces to vexatious claims by setting a precedent that non-state actors can initiate proceedings. So what steps is the Minister taking to ensure the UK is at the forefront of reforms of the ICC?
The UK respects the ICC's independence, but we are working with other countries to bring about positive change within the court. The UK was instrumental in the establishment of the Independent Expert Review, which reported in September together with other state parties. Additionally, the UK is driving forward reforms to governance, prosecutorial excellence, and a more rigorous approach to budget control and value for money.
We now come to Jonathan Gillis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do hope Madam Deputy Speaker will be pleased I've got a jacket accompanying my jumper today. So, it's been almost a year since my right honourable friend expressed his hopes that the European Union would produce a balanced and independently produced report into the Palestinian Authority school curriculum, which contains shocking material inciting violence against Israel and Jews. So what steps will the government take if the long-awaited report due for publication this month falls short of the required standard?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this point and the consistent approach he has taken to this issue. We remain concerned about the allegations in Palestinian Authority textbooks and have lobbied European partners to bring forward their reports in a timely manner. I've also discussed this issue directly with the Palestinian Authority's representative here in the UK, and we have regular discussions with the EU to encourage them to get this report into the public domain. In the interim, the UK will continue to raise our concerns bilaterally with the Palestinian Authority at the very highest levels.
Substantive question to Minister Dutridge.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I answer Group 26 and 27 together. In December, the UK co-hosted the Climate Ambition Summit, where 75 world leaders set out more ambitious climate commitments. Last week, the PM chaired the UN Security Council debate on this issue. In addition, the Foreign Secretary has discussed climate in his meetings with the US, Brazil, India, and amongst other counterparts.
We now go to Jack Brereton. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his response. Would he agree our hosting of the UN's Conference on Climate Change, to be held in Scotland this year, reinforces the UK's claim to be leading the world in tackling climate change?
I welcome that question. It appears, Mr. Speaker, we're welcoming the whole family into the House. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. The UK has a proud record of climate leadership. In 2019, we were the first major economy to legislate for net zero by 2050. We're also doubling our international climate finance facility to 11.6 billion in the 2021 to 2025 period. And this year, we're encouraging every country to make ambitious new pledges to fulfil the 2015 Paris Agreement.
Let's go to Paul Howell. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Base Select Committee, I'm very interested in the international engagement in COP26. And could he please outline for me exactly what actions the Department is taking to help the President of the COP26 to maximise the potential for a successful event in Glasgow?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. In every call that we make as ministers, we raise this issue. My right honourable friend, the member for Reading West as COP President-designate, has the full support of the diplomatic network. In fact, even just last month, he met with Ethiopian, Gabonese, Egyptian, Nigerian, Indian and Nepalese partners, and those are the only ones that I know about. Later this month, furthermore, we will convene international partners to help identify practical solutions to the challenge every country must face, particularly to help the most vulnerable around this really important issue of climate change.
A substantive question to Minister Clever.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 28, 29 and 30 together. The UK remains concerned about the fragile humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza. The UK is providing £4.5 million in humanitarian assistance to the OPTs, including £1 million to UNRWA's emergency appeal and £2.5 million to the World Food Programme for cash assistance. The UK supports UNRWA as a vital humanitarian force in the region, and FCDO is running a prioritisation exercise across all its programmes to ensure every pound goes as far as possible.
Let's go to Alan Brown. Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister rightly highlights forced evictions and demolitions break international law, but nonetheless, Israel continues with evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and Bata and Alawa. The proposed construction of 1,200 houses at Givat Hamatos is out to tender at the moment, so action is needed, not just words. So when will the UK government implement trade bans on goods from illegal settlements?
The UK's position on this issue is long-standing and clear. We oppose the sanction. We oppose the points that he's put forward. We do raise the issues of demolitions regularly with our Israeli counterparts, and we will continue to do so at every opportunity.
Let's head to Andy Slaughter. Andy.
Aid budgets implies the loss of a third in UNRWA funding. There are rumours the government could be planning to cut twice this. UNRWA is responsible for almost 6 million Palestinian refugees, including the education of 500,000 children, the healthcare of 3 million, and emergency food aid for over 1 million. Because of the occupation, Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and surrounding countries rely on UNRWA for basic public services. So will the Minister give a clear and courageous answer and guarantee at least the current level of funding?
The UK government, as I said, regards UNRWA as an important partner in support of the people in the OPTs and surrounding areas. We are going through a prioritisation exercise at the moment, the outcome of which will be published in due course.
Go to Joanna Cherry. Joanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As schools around the world deal with the challenges of the COVID pandemic, Palestinian school children face a further threat. According to the United Nations, 53 Palestinian schools in the occupied West Bank are subject to Israeli government demolition orders. Does the Minister agree with me that demolishing any school is wrong and that any such action should have consequences?
Mr. Speaker, the UK raises regularly the issue of demolitions, and our position on this is clear. We will continue to do so, and we will continue to highlight the importance of education, which remains one of the government priorities.
We go to Shadow Minister Wayne David. Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Israeli COVID-19 vaccination programme is the best in the world. However, the Minister has indicated that Israel has a legal responsibility to ensure the health and well-being of Palestinians on the West Bank. Will the Minister therefore join with me to urge the Israeli government to work with the Palestinian Authority so that Palestinians are vaccinated as well as Israelis?
Mr. Speaker, the UK is justifiably proud of the work it is doing on the international stage with regard to vaccinations, including through Gavi and the COVAX scheme. We're pleased to see the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority coordinating their work with regard to vaccinations, and we look forward to that vaccination programme rolling out across not just Israel, but also the people who are living in the OPTs.
We now come to topicals. Secretary of State.
Speaker, since the last oral questions, I visited East Africa. I also visited Cyprus, where I met President Anastasiades and the Turkish Cypriot leader in support of the peace initiative and the UN talks. I also met on the 18th of February with our E3 partners in Paris and also with the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, to coordinate our approach to Iran. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the international community, and I'm sure the whole House will be pleased to say, elected not just the first British female judge to the International Criminal Court, but the first British Chief Prosecutor.
Let's head to Robert Logan. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly condemned the UN Human Rights Council for its disproportionate focus on Israel, which he said was, and I quote, damaging to the cause of peace. As the UN Human Rights Council meets over the coming weeks, will the government commit to voting against one-sided resolutions singling out Israel, including those outside of permanent agenda item 7, in order to send a clear message that such blatant anti-Israel bias will not be tolerated?
Can I thank my honourable friend? I think he's absolutely right, and we've stood up for Israel when it faces bias and, frankly, politicised attacks in the UN and other forums. We will continue to press for the abolition of Item 7 because it is the only country-specific standalone agenda item, and it focuses on Israel, and that can't be right.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Nandi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The US intelligence report released last Friday makes a clear and compelling case that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman approved the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Last year, the Foreign Secretary said that those with blood on their hands about this killing would not set foot in the City of London, and we will seize your blood-drenched, ill-gotten gains if you do. So can he confirm that he will be bringing forward sanctions against bin Salman following this report, and that he does now finally accept that it is time, finally, to reappraise fundamentally our relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I think she's a bit behind the curve there. Of course, Saudi Arabia have an important relationship with it on security, on trade, on other things. But the reality is, it was this government and me who introduced Magnitsky sanctions on 20 Saudis involved in the murder under our global human rights regime. We did it last July. She ought to catch up.
I'm frankly astonished, Mr. Speaker. I did genuinely expect a better response from him. So he won't stand with the family of Jamal Khashoggi as they seek justice. He won't stand to lift a finger against the dirty money flowing into the City of London. He won't stand with our allies, ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And he won't even defend the children of Yemen against brutal aid cuts by his own department, even as his government seeks to sustain the conflict that they are party to. I mean, I have to say to him that last year we heard him talk tough about standing up to despots and henchmen, but now he tells us that in response to this report he's not prepared to take a single action, won't stand up to corruption, won't stand against humanitarian catastrophe, won't stand up for press freedom, and won't stand up for human rights. Is there a single thing that he will actually stand up for?
Well, I can again say to the Honourable Lady, we were right out in the lead in opposing asset freezes and visa bans on 20 of the most directly responsible. She refers to the US report. The US haven't put sanctions on the Crown Prince, as she well knows. More generally, she will have seen the action that we have taken. She ought to listen. In relation to dirty money, we have already said, and I've committed to this House, to introduce an extension of the Magnitsky sanctions to cover corruption. Well, she's now going on to talk about Russia, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is, we will continue to support standing up for human rights, and I will be introducing to the House Magnitsky sanctions and an extension to the corruption space shortly.
Let's go to Angela Richardson. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The growing ties between Israel and her Arab neighbours are extremely positive developments that provide an opportunity to reinvigorate the Middle East peace process, which has regrettably stalled for many years. Can my right honourable friend outline what more the UK can do to help support the resumption of direct peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians alongside our allies in the region?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend? We supported the normalisation of relations. I think that's a good step around the region. It, of course, also led to the suspension of the threat of annexation on the West Bank, which I think was very important. As a result of that, I was able to go and talk to President Abbas and Prime Minister Shea and encourage them to resume dialogue on West Bank issues, which is very important for security, but also to make sure Palestinian public servants are paid. There are plans, at least mooted, for elections on both sides, both in Israel but also on the Palestinian side. I think ultimately we need leadership from both sides to secure the peace that she wants, and I think honourable members in this House want. We need a two-state solution. The UK will support all of those efforts.
Let's go to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan, we appear no closer to a successful exit strategy. The NATO mission faces difficult choices: leave and see the Afghan government fall, continue the stalemate and face a permanent involvement in the country, or ramp up the war with the devastation that follows and no guarantee of success. What discussions are the British government having with the Biden administration about the way forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are having discussions with the Biden administration on the approach to the proposed US withdrawal or drawdown from Afghanistan. It has got to be linked to violence on the ground and, of course, the wider peace talks and the agreements that have been made in Afghanistan between all of the local parties, and it's got to be based on delivery of those conditions.
Steve Brown.
Given COVID-19 is reported to have killed more than 120,000 of our fellow citizens, it is reasonable in time to understand where lessons can be learned domestically. But surely it's our moral duty to establish the origins of the virus and how it spread as an international community. So can I ask the Minister, what is the British government's view on where this came from and the efficacy of the WHO's current fact-finding mission to China?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend asks a very, very sensible question. We, the United Kingdom, co-sponsored the World Health Assembly resolution in May 2020 that agreed an investigation into the origins of COVID. It's important that that investigation is given the time. The field mission to Wuhan was a key early step in the investigation. Of course, we can't preempt findings, but we will look closely at the field mission's report when it's published. We've been clear that the investigation must be robust, open and scientifically rigorous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting the urgent question next from the member for Sutton Coldfield on Yemen, a human rights catastrophe. Similarly, I believe that every member of this House must acknowledge the humanitarian hellhole that Syria has become over the past decade. Given that the existing programme has now run out, will the Secretary of State update the House on our country's intentions on welcoming refugees to our shores from Syria and the region, and the good quality of life that we will guarantee them once they're here?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? Of course, we'll continue to make sure we provide vital humanitarian support. I agree with her, it's an appalling crisis that we see ongoing in Syria. She asked, I think, about the plans that the Home Office have for a new global resettlement scheme. That's for the Home Secretary to talk about, but it is a diplomatic issue. She's right, which is why I'll fully support it.
Let's head to David Simmons. David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is a global leader in refugee resettlement, and the new UK resettlement scheme will demonstrate global Britain's efforts to tackle humanitarian crises wherever they are. How far does my right honourable friend consider that refugee resettlement is an important part of the UK's wider diplomatic efforts, in particular supporting those who may now be refugees who've been involved in supporting our military and peacekeeping efforts?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable friend who raises an important point. The truth is I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for this country's proud tradition of offering sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. We've resettled 25,000 refugees since 2015 with the support of brilliant charities. I've got a particular one that I always think of, Elmbridge Can, in my constituency, that helps those new families settle in. We remain committed to do that and to discharge that historic role, and the new global resettlement scheme will be developed and launched by the Home Office in due course.
Let's head to Alan Brown. Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The perception of prioritising corporate interests and market-friendly laws over economic fairness, local communities and the environment has resulted in Indian farming protests. Given Foreign Office silence on this, will the Prime Minister be raising the injustices that these farmers feel when he visits India?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? And I do appreciate that there are concerns here. We have a large Indian diaspora. We've had lots of constituents writing in. I did raise this with Foreign Minister Jaishankar when I was there. We discussed it. Ultimately, this is the result of a reform a reform agenda that the government, elected government, is pressing through. Of course, it's contentious. We have discussed it, but ultimately it is for the government of India to decide.
Mr. Speaker. The government has made it clear that we must protect the reputation of organisations such as the UN Human Rights Council. And given our work on gender-based violence, and given the fact that next Monday is International Women's Day, I'll be grateful for an update on what work is being undertaken on the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative, and what steps we might take to implement an international body that can support survivors, document crimes and lead prosecutions.
Thank you. Oh, hello. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. PSVI remains a top priority for the UK government. We've committed £48 million since the launch of PSVI in 2012. We've funded 85 projects across 29 countries to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. And of course, the UK's G7 presidency is an excellent opportunity for us to galvanise support for the PSVI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm the government's commitment to a bizonal, bicommunal federation as the only basis for a political settlement on the island of Cyprus ahead of next month's UN-sponsored 5+1 talks in Geneva?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? I was out in Cyprus recently, as I've already discussed. I spoke to President Anastasiades, I spoke to Ersin Tatar, the new Turkish Cypriot leader. That is, of course, the starting point. The most important thing we need to see right now is for both sides to go to those UN 5+1 talks without preconditions, so we can re-engage in the kind of flexibility and pragmatism that can see lasting and enduring peace for the whole of Cyprus.
We now go to Marco Longhi. Marco.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what steps is my right honourable friend taking to respond to the ongoing campaign for Papuan independence, please?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government has repeatedly asserted our long-held position that we respect the territorial integrity of Indonesia, including the provinces of Papua and West Papua. The UK government categorically does not support the activities or views of Papuan separatist activists. The presence of some individuals, including Benny Wender in the UK, in no way means that we support their position. We engage with a diverse range of cultural and political figures in the Papua region, and our ambassador made a visit to Papua in November, where he met environment, education and human rights experts, as well as the governor of West Papua.
Let's head to Janet Davey. Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Iranian officials have made it clear the imprisonment of British dual nationals is directly linked to the 400 million IMS debt. The longer our government denies this link, the longer Anousheh, Nazanin and others will be kept away from their families. Can the Foreign Secretary tell me what considerations have been given to an urgent repayment of this debt through alternative means such as COVID-19 supplies or other medical aid?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? She takes a heartfelt interest in this, and I have spoken to all of the families recently of all three of the British Iranian dual nationals she refers to. Of course, we accept that there is a long-standing debt and dispute in relation to the IMS debt that needs to be resolved. That is separate from the issue of the arbitrarily detained British nationals, and frankly, I don't think we should be giving succour to the idea that they shouldn't be anything other than released unconditionally and immediately.
Sent to Damien Moore. Damien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IAEA has confirmed that Iran's stockpile of uranium is now more than 14 times over the limit agreed in the 2015 nuclear deal. Does my right honourable friend believe the framework is working, and what consequences will there be for Iran's continued non-compliance?
I thank my honourable friend. He raises an important issue that Iran's systemic non-compliance with its obligations on the JCPOA are rightly the concern of the whole international community, particularly the JCPOA state parties. Iran has, frankly, a clear choice: to return to compliance or to face increasing economic and diplomatic isolation. I can reassure him that I, on the 18th of February, joined in Paris my French and German counterparts, but also the new US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, to reinforce the transatlantic alliance and concerted action to bring Iran back to full compliance. And that's our overriding focus.
Kat Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I draw the Secretary of State's attention to War on Want's new report into Israel's military court system in the occupied West Bank, and does he agree that Palestinian civilians should not be tried in military courts, and what is his government doing to support Palestinian human rights defenders who have been tried in them?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? Look, she's right to draw attention to the treatment of Palestinians. The reality is, I don't think as a matter of international law, let alone under the ICC system, there is a bar on the use of military systems of justice. Indeed, we use a military system of justice. We've got one of the highest standards of the world. What's crucial is that there is adequate due process to make sure that people's rights can be fairly and duly heard.
We have our final question from Mary Robinson. Mary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the last case arising from Jonathan Taylor's whistleblowing concluded, with Paul Bond being sentenced to 3.5 years in prison for conspiracy to give corrupt payments. Jonathan Taylor has been vindicated again, but he remains stranded in Croatia due to the Interpol red notice issued by Monaco, based on a debunked allegation by his old employer in retaliation for his whistleblowing. Now the relevant court cases are complete, will my right honourable friend redouble his efforts to bring Mr Taylor home? And will he speak to ministerial colleagues about the need for whistleblowing law reform, so in future, people like Jonathan Taylor get the support and the protection they need?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are providing ongoing consular support to Mr Taylor. Consular staff have been in regular contact with Mr Taylor and his UK lawyer. The British ambassador in Zagreb met Mr Taylor in December to discuss Mr Taylor's concerns and explain the FCDO's consular functions, and I spoke to the Monegasque Foreign Secretary and the Croatian Secretary of State for European Affairs in November, and sought assurances that both authorities were giving full consideration to the fact that Mr Taylor is a whistleblower. The UK is a state party to a number of multilateral conventions which require adequate arrangements to be made for the protection of whistleblowers. The UK has made appropriate provisions to do so in our own law, demonstrating the seriousness with which it takes our obligation, and in doing so encourages our international partners to do likewise. We are, however, unable to protect whistleblowers in other jurisdictions that may not have the same law.
Right. I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business. Order. I now call Andrew Mitchell for the urgent question. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask the Minister if he will make a statement on the level of aid funding to Yemen?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, for raising this urgent question. The situation in Yemen remains amongst the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Two-thirds of the entire population, more than 20 million people, requiring some form of humanitarian assistance. The UN estimates that in the first half of this year, 47,000 people will be in famine conditions and 16.2 million at risk of starvation. Improving the dire circumstances faced by so many Yemenis continues to be a priority for this government. Yesterday, I attended the high-level pledging conference for the United Nations Humanitarian Appeal for Yemen. I announced that the UK will provide at least £87 million in aid to Yemen over the course of the financial year 21-22. Our total aid contribution since the conflict began was already over £1 billion. This new pledge will feed an additional 240,000 of the most vulnerable Yemenis every month, support 400 health clinics, and provide clean water for 1.6 million people. We will also provide one-off cash support to 1.5 million of Yemeni's poorest households to help them buy food and basic supplies. Alongside the money that we are spending to reduce humanitarian suffering in Yemen, the UK continues to play a leading diplomatic role in support of the UN's efforts to end the conflict. Yesterday, I spoke to the United Nations Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, and we discussed how the UK could assist him in ending this devastating war. Last week, the United Nations Security Council adopted a UK-drafted resolution which reiterated the Council's support for United Nations peace process, condemned the Houthi offensive in Marib and attacks on Saudi Arabia, and sanctioned Houthi official Sultan Zabin for the use of sexual violence as a tool of war. Just last night, a Houthi missile hit and injured 5 civilians in southern Saudi Arabia. I condemn this further attack by the Houthis on civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and reiterate our commitment to help Saudi Arabia defend itself. We're also working closely with our regional and international partners for peace. On the 25th of February, the Foreign Secretary spoke to the Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan about the Yemen peace process, and he also recently discussed this with the UN Secretary of State. I discussed Yemen with the Omani ambassador to the UK on the 4th of February and spoke to the Yemeni Foreign Minister on the 20th of January regarding the attack on Aden and the formation of a new Yemeni cabinet. The UK is also leading efforts to tackle COVID-19 in Yemen and around the world. This month, as part of the UN Security Council presidency, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, called for a ceasefire across the globe to allow vulnerable people living in conflict zones to be vaccinated against COVID-19. As one of the biggest donors to the World Health Organization and Gavi's COVAX initiative, the UK is helping ensure millions of vaccine doses get through to people living in crises like Yemen. I thank my right honourable friend for raising this question and thank honourable members for their continued interest in Yemen. The conflict and humanitarian crisis deserves our attention, and the UK government remains fully committed to doing what we can to help secure a better future for Yemenis.
I now call on Andrew Mitchell, who has 2 minutes. Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is a decent fellow and will not have enjoyed what he announced yesterday. Last night he will have heard the United Nations General Secretary tell him that for Yemen, and I quote, "Cutting aid is a death sentence. Cutting it by 50% is unconscionable." As the senior and respected British official at the UN, Sir Mark Lowcock, said, millions of Yemeni children will now continue the slow, agonising and obscene process of starving to death. Mr. Speaker, I remain, I understand, the only European politician who has been recently into Sadr in North Yemen to see an acute malnutrition ward in the hospital there, part funded by the British taxpayer. Life-saving work which will now be halved. My right honourable friend told this House just last month that, and I quote, "Yemen will remain a UK priority," and yet the 5th richest country in the world is cutting support by more than half to one of the poorest countries in the world, and during a global pandemic. Every single member of this House, Mr. Speaker, was elected just over a year ago on a promise to maintain the 0.7. Aid has been cut already under that formula because our economy has contracted. But the government told this House that they would protect 7 strategic priorities, including, and I quote, human preparedness and response. No one in this House, Mr. Speaker, believes that the Foreign Secretary wants to do this. It is a harbinger of terrible cuts to come. Everyone in this House knows that the cut to the 0.7 is not a result of tough choices. It is a strategic mistake with deadly consequences. Mr. Speaker, this is not who we are. This is not how global Britain acts. We are a generous, decent country. The 0.7 is enshrined in law, Mr. Speaker. This House must surely have a vote. We must all search our consciences.
Minister?
I genuinely thank my right honourable friend. He speaks with authority and passion as an experienced member of this House and as a former Secretary of State for International Development. I would remind the House that the commitment we made at the pledging conference represents a floor, not a ceiling, and the figures that we have ultimately distributed in previous years have in every one of those years exceeded the figure pledged. We are going through a process at the moment where we work out how we distribute our ODA. In whatever way that process concludes, we will remain, in both absolute terms and percentage terms, one of the most generous ODA donating countries in the world, and to Yemen itself, we still remain one of the largest donors to that humanitarian crisis.
I now go to Shadow Minister Preet Kaur, who is participating virtually, who's also got 2 minutes. Preet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's announcement yesterday at the High Pledging Conference discarded the British people's proud history of stepping up and supporting those in need. In the middle of a pandemic, when millions stand on the brink of famine, the government slashed life-saving support to the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, halving direct aid to Yemen weeks after it announced 1.36 billion in new arms licenses to Saudi Arabia. This is a devastating reminder of the real-world impact the government's choices to abandon its manifesto commitment on aid will have on the most vulnerable people, and shows that this government just cannot be trusted to keep its word. After 6 years of brutal conflict, 2/3 of the Yemeni population are reliant on food aid to survive, and thousands of people in the country are at risk of famine. Cutting aid is a death sentence that this government have chosen to make. So will the Minister take this opportunity to apologise? Alongside this cut in humanitarian support, the UK continues to sustain the war in Yemen. Will the Minister follow the lead set by President Biden by stopping all UK arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition so we can use our role as the penholder on Yemen to help bring this brutal conflict to an end? If the Foreign Secretary is willing to brazenly slash support to people living in the world's worst humanitarian disaster, despite claiming for months that humanitarian crisis were a priority, then the question is, what's going to happen to the rest of the aid budget on other priorities? The Minister has refused, and I quote, to talk to the aid and development community about what will be cut, because he is ashamed. He is ashamed that the government's cut will put millions of people's lives at risk. This government cannot continue to pretend otherwise. So will they publish a full list of the cuts made in 2020 and of the cuts to be made in 2021 by the end of this week? What we've seen yesterday are not the actions of global Britain. That phrase rings hollow. Make no mistake, as the UK abandons its commitment to 0.10%, it is simultaneously undermining our global reputation. Does the Minister believe that he has the support of this House to make this appalling cut? And if so, will he bring forward a vote on the 0.7% commitment? Tomorrow, the Chancellor has a choice. He must reverse his decision to make the UK the only G7 nation to cut its aid budget. It must reverse its government's retreat from the world stage and celebrate Britain's proud history as a country that stands up for the world's poorest and most vulnerable in society. That is the true test of global Britain. Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our aid budget, our ODA spend is incredibly important. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has made it clear that this year that figure will remain at £10 billion. That £10 billion represents one of the largest aid budgets in both absolute terms and in relative terms in the globe. She speaks about the change from 0.7% to 0.5%. Might I remind the House that the Labour government or Labour politicians have been talking about 0.7% of GNI as an ODA budget for decades, and yet never once got near that 0.7%. Even in the years of benign economic circumstances, they never went above 0.51%. Under Conservative Prime Ministers, this country has spent 0.7% consistently, and we have done so even in difficult economic circumstances. But we are now presented, as my right honourable friend the Chancellor will outline tomorrow, I'm sure, in the budget, we are now presented with a unique set of economic circumstances, unprecedented in our lifetime, representing a constriction of the UK economy unseen in centuries. And yet, against that backdrop, we maintain a commitment to spend £10 billion on the international stage. But as I say, money is not the only thing that the UK can deploy in support of the people of Yemen. I outlined in the previous session in departmental questions the work that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has done on the international level to bring about change in the UN Security Council. I spoke yesterday with Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Representative, about what diplomatic efforts the UK can bring to bear to bring about the end of the war in conflict, because that, Mr. Speaker, is the precursor to a truly sustainable improvement in the situation. And that is why we condemned the continued attacks by the Houthis and those that support them. That is why we have sanctioned senior Houthi leaders for the use of sexual violence as a tool of war. And that is why we'll continue working bilaterally and internationally to bring about a conclusion to that terrible conflict.
Let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I welcome very much the phrase that my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, said, that this is a floor, not a ceiling. I very much hope that the ceiling will be somewhat greater than he has announced. But would he agree with me that the UK's position, while generous, does leave a large gap if there is indeed any cut, and the world's poorest will be the ones to suffer? Has he reached out to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, indeed to Oman, to ask them to help fill the gap? Or perhaps even to Iran, who have so used the Houthi people as their tools, as their instruments of violence in the region? Has he asked them, first of all, to stop the instrumentalization of terror, and asked them to perhaps fund to rebuild the destruction that they have caused?
The honourable friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, makes a very good point about the convening power that the UK can exercise, and also the strong bilateral relations we have with countries in the region. I'm very pleased to see that a number of countries in the Gulf were very generous, even though they, like us, are suffering from economic difficulties. We will continue to lobby the international community for support. I have not had, and unfortunately I don't think we currently enjoy the bilateral relations with Iran to make credible requests or to make requests that we believe will be forthcoming. But we will continue to encourage Iran, to push Iran to be a better regional neighbour, a better regional partner, and in the immediate term, we strongly encourage Iran to stop supporting the Houthis, and we encourage the Houthis to end their campaign of violence against Yemenis and Saudis alike.
I call SNP spokesperson Chris Law, who's participating virtually, who's got 1 minute. Chris Law.
Gosh, Mr. Speaker, this government should hang its head in shame. UK cutting humanitarian aid to Yemen by 50% is confirmation that the UK government is playing a pivotal role in the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. The UK shamefully confirmed it will continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, laying bare the reality of this government's vision for global Britain, profiteering from weapons without concern for the devastation they cause, and relinquishing its responsibility to those who are starving and to save lives. Mr. Speaker, let's be in no doubt, this isn't global Britain, this is more like little Britain. Indeed, the UK is actively adding to 16 million people being put into hunger, 5 million civilians facing starvation, and over 3 million people displaced as a result of this conflict. As Mark Lowcock said at the UN, if you're not feeding the people, you're feeding the war. In response to continued SNP calls to halt UK arms sales to the Saudis, this government has always stated that they're also the biggest aid contributor in order to clear their conscience. So I asked the Minister, is this conscience still clear? And what is this government's response going to be following these death sentence cuts?
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the honourable gentleman that the United Kingdom remains one of the largest donor countries, not just to the Yemen humanitarian crisis appeal, but also on the international stage. I will also remind the honourable gentleman that just yesterday, Houthis sent missile attacks against civilians which injured Saudis and Yemenis alike. The best thing that can happen to secure an improvement in the humanitarian situation, a sustainable humanitarian improvement, is the end of the conflict. And the UK is working hard to do that. However, countries have the right to defend themselves, and the consistent attacks, both within Yemen and into Saudi, must stop. Our support for aid, our support for the humanitarian situation in Yemen will remain. We remain one of the largest donors, and as I say, we are proud of the fact that we are helping to feed children, provide clean water, and provide medical assistance.
Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that the UK is one of the biggest donors to the crisis in Yemen, committing well over £1 billion in UK aid since the conflict began back in 2015. But we all know that money alone is not enough. Does my right honourable friend agree that progress can only be made through international cooperation, with everyone playing their part to solve this crisis?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Money makes a difference. We recognise that, which is why we remain one of the most generous bilateral donors to the humanitarian appeal. But money itself will not bring about a positive conclusion to the situation in Yemen. That is the philosophy that underpinned the merger of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development, to ensure that our diplomatic efforts and our development efforts go hand in hand. I regularly, and my right honourable friend the Foreign Secretary, regularly raise the issues of this conflict with regional partners and others to work with the United Nations and the Special Representative Martin Griffiths to bring about a permanent conclusion to the conflict in Yemen, and we will continue to do so until that comes about.
The other chair of the Select Committee, Sarah Champion. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, what is the reason behind cutting the aid to Yemen by 60%? What impact assessment has been made on the cutting aid to those previously supported? And particularly, I'm thinking about the impact on women and girls, people with disabilities, and internally displaced people.
Mr. Speaker, I will remind the honourable lady, who I have a huge amount of respect for, and the House, that, as I said in my speech, this represents a floor, not a ceiling. In every year previously, we have exceeded our initial pledging total, and we hope to be able to do so again in this situation. However, I will also remind the House that we face an unprecedented economic situation. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor, have all made it clear that this is a temporary reduction, and will seek to get back to the 0.7% as soon as the economic circumstances allow us to do so. We will continue our work on the international sphere to address the short-term issues of this humanitarian crisis, what we hope to be short-term issues of humanitarian crisis, whilst also putting the full weight of UK diplomatic efforts to trying to bring about a sustainable, peaceful solution to this conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our £240 million worth of aid funding for Yemen this year will support at least 500,000 vulnerable people each month to help them buy food and household essentials, treat 55,000 children for malnutrition, and provide 1 million people with improved water supply and basic sanitation. Can my right honourable friend reassure the House that he's stressing to the conflict parties that it is essential they allow this aid to reach those that it is intended to help? And does he agree that given these figures, that now is not the time to be reducing aid to those that we supply in Yemen who are in most need?
Yeah. I recognise the points he makes about the totality of our aid spending, and we will have, my colleagues will have heard that. But we also very much support the point he's making about ensuring the aid gets to the people that is needed. That need it, and that we maintain humanitarian corridors, which is why we have spoken with the Houthis and others about ensuring those humanitarian corridors are maintained.
To Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The crisis in Yemen is wholly human-made. Thousands have died as a result of the war. Thousands of children have lost homes, lost schools, and poverty and starvation are the order of the day. Britain's record in this is appalling. Throughout this whole conflict, we've armed Saudi Arabia, knowing full well that those missiles are killing people in Yemen, and at the same time claiming to be the harbingers of peace by organising a resolution at the United Nations. Will the Minister make it very clear that all arms sales to Saudi Arabia will stop, and that Britain will be a determined partner in trying to bring about a peace process through a ceasefire as quickly as possible, and to build good relations with all countries in that region? Too many people have died. The conflict has gone on too long, and it simply has to stop, and we should be a party to ending the war, not promoting the war.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman speaks with an authoritative voice, particularly in Iran. And perhaps if he would also call upon the Iranian regime to no longer give lethal support to the Houthis, that might be a big step in the right direction to bring about a sustainable peace in Yemen.
Speaker, there's a strong convention that before a government undertakes a policy which puts lives at risk, it gets prior approval from this House. You can't make a 50% cut in this budget without cutting into the crisis and healthcare support, thereby putting at least 100,000 children's lives at risk. Will my right honourable friend guarantee that before the budget votes are held next week, we can have a written statement giving a breakdown of the cuts made this year in the aid budget, and undertaking that no more cuts will be undertaken unless and until this House approves it?
Mr. Speaker, the convention that my right honourable friend refers to, I'm not completely sure is relevant in this situation. The Foreign Secretary has said before, we are looking very carefully at what is required by law. The legislation envisaged that 0.7% target may not be met in a particular year in light of economic and fiscal circumstances, and the legislation provides for reporting to Parliament in the event that the target is not met. The Government obviously intends to abide by the legislation. The economic situation is difficult to predict, but we do wish to get back up to the 0.7 as soon as the economic circumstances allow.
Said to Leila Moran. Leila.
Mr. Speaker, the government's appalling decision to cut aid to Yemen has been described as a death sentence by the UN Secretary-General, and he's right. This enormous cut in a year when 400,000 children under 5 might starve to death is not just heartless. Just like the cut to 0.7%, it also damages the UK's international reputation. And they're doing this, Mr. Speaker, just weeks after announcing £1.36 billion in new arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the exact opposite of what the United States is doing. So I ask the Minister, is this what we can now expect? The UK government shrinking away from its commitments, leaving other, more compassionate countries to pick up the slack?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady implies that expenditure is the only appropriate measure for compassion. And if that is the case, I think she should recognise that the UK is one of the most generous ODA donating countries in the world, in both absolute terms and relative terms. And therefore, I would remind her that she, and indeed the House, should remain proud of the position the UK takes. However, I would also remind her and the House that we face unprecedented economic circumstances. And the quicker that those are resolved, the quicker we can get back to being the generous international aid donor that we all wish to be.
Damien Green. Damien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The legislation allows the government to miss the 0.7% target by accident or in an emergency, but not to plan to miss it for an indefinite number of years ahead. So can my right honourable friend give a commitment today that further cuts won't be made until that necessary legislation promised by ministers to this House to enact this policy has been put to a vote so that this House can express a view?
Mr. Speaker, I hear what the right honourable gentleman says. The Foreign Secretary, as I have said, is looking carefully at the requirements of the legislation, and I can assure him from this position in the dispatch box that the government is well able to listen to the mood of the House without the need for legislation in this issue.
Hilary Benn. Hilary.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The ministers referred to the humanitarian aid that the UK has already given to Yemen, which we recognise, but I'm afraid he has failed today to explain why the government has now decided to cut that contribution by more than half. Doing the right thing in the past is not a justification for doing the wrong thing now. Yesterday, a Yemeni aid worker coordinating food aid distribution said this: "Children are dying every day here. It is not a moral decision to abandon Yemen." Why has the government done this when, for example, Germany, which is also facing the same unprecedented economic situation, to use his own words, has managed to pledge twice as much as the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, different countries at yesterday's pledging events put forward their pledges. Some increased their pledges, some reduced their pledges. Each country is facing its own economic challenges, and the UK remains, despite the unprecedented economic circumstances that we face, one of the largest donors, both in general terms and also in terms of the humanitarian support for Yemen. I would also make the point that whilst the money is of course incredibly important, and that is why we have committed to at least £87 million in this financial year, there are other resources that we bring to bear to bring about an improvement in this situation, including our voice on the international stage, our lobbying power, our political power, and we will continue to work to bring about an end to the conflict in Yemen.
The list, I'm going to finish at 10 past. Anthony Magnum.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister just started off his remarks by saying that money matters. And yes, it does. But what this cut represents is a cut to projects, a cut to aid, a cut to assistance that is going to put lives in jeopardy. Now, if the government is so reassured by its position, then I suggest it brings a vote to the House on this issue and they can truly gauge the strength of feeling on this issue. We have a moral duty to lead on this issue, and I hope he will consider bringing a vote before it is too late.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously, the Foreign Secretary is looking at the legal requirements around this situation. I completely understand his passion, but I would remind him and the House that we remain one of the largest donors to this humanitarian crisis.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, according to the APPG, in the report published yesterday, APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, the last remaining Jewish communities in Yemen were ordered to leave in 2020, and the Yemeni Christian community, which once numbered some 41,000, has now shrunk to just a few thousand. Moreover, the Yemeni Baha'i community faced increased persecution at the hands of Houthi authorities last year. So will the Minister share his views on how aid spending in Yemen can be better used to support religious and belief minority groups in Yemen?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The UK provide secondees to the office of Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Representative. A number of those secondees focus specifically on broad engagement of minorities within the peace process. I have spoken on a number of occasions of the importance of ensuring both protection for minority communities in conflict, protection for religious minorities in conflict, and also an inclusive set of people around the negotiating table once peace negotiations are underway.
Tim Morton. Let's go to Tim.
Mr. Speaker, as chair of the Yemen All-Party Group, yesterday I spoke to some very brave women from within Marib under long-term siege from the Houthis, and they told me that most of the Houthi forces are young men, teenage boys recruited from the most impoverished parts of Yemen. They also told me that Marib is now hosting over 2 million displaced people across 144 camps, with many children not just suffering from famine and disease, but also deeply traumatized after having been driven out by the Houthis. They all rely on generous UK aid and the example that it sets to other countries who need to step up in the humanitarian aid effort and the subsequent reconstruction. So how can indicating a cut in UK aid at this crucial time do anything but prolong this terrible conflict?
Mr. Speaker, the situation that he describes in Marib is one which is deeply, deeply concerning. We've called upon the Houthis to end their assault. Marib has become the temporary home for many internally displaced people, and the situation there is dire. A number of people have mentioned about our support or our relationship with neighbouring countries, and of course defending Marib against this Houthi assault is part of the conversations we have, but ultimately the best thing we can do is bring about a swift end to this conflict.
Alison.
And no matter how much the Minister attempts to hide behind how much the UK gives, it won't disguise the impact that this brutal 60% cut will have on the life chances of Yemenis. Save the Children say that already 400,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of starving to death this year. So I asked the Minister, how many deaths is he prepared, how many deaths is this Tory government prepared to have on its conscience, because it certainly doesn't act in my name.
Mr. Speaker, the UK has consistently been one of the largest donors to humanitarian appeal, and our money is keeping people alive. We're very proud of that fact. The economic circumstances that we are currently living through has meant that we have to temporarily reduce the amount of money we are spending in overseas development assistance, but has been made clear by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor and others, as soon as the economic circumstances allow us to get back to where we were, we will do so.
Vice Hellwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The humanitarian crisis is terrible, as has been said. There's also more international terrorist attacks organised from Yemen than anywhere else in the world. The Biden administration is rewriting its foreign policy towards Yemen. I can't think of a better opportunity to end this tragic civil war, but I'm not picking up a Yemen strategy that befits the strapline global Britain. Could I ask the Minister to match the political courage of our closest security ally in tackling the humanitarian crisis, cutting the arms exports, and also be ready to lead any peacekeeping force should the UN require it once a ceasefire is agreed?
Mr. Speaker, Yemen remains one of the priority areas for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. As I say, I spoke only yesterday with Martin Griffiths, and we discussed what further support the UK government can provide for his work to bring about a sustainable ceasefire. The House will have heard, indeed my government colleagues will have heard the suggestions he put forward, and we will consider all suggestions to bring about an improvement in Yemen, but at this stage I can't commit to the points he's made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The world's largest humanitarian crisis is getting worse. Blockades of ports and airports are restricting vital humanitarian and aid getting to the 80% of the population who need it. This year alone, 2.3 million children under the age of 5 face acute malnutrition. Cutting support as a country battles coronavirus and faces a cholera outbreak is callous and heartless. Can the Minister explain how this fits into the government's pledge to build a global Britain?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes a very good point about access of humanitarian aid, and I'm very proud of the fact that the UK government has lobbied international partners to maintain those humanitarian access routes. We have also provided support in a technical manner to help assess the best way of distributing aid so that it gets to the people most in need, and we'll continue to provide not just financial support but also technical support to help the people of Yemen whilst also working to bring about a conclusion to this conflict.
To David Mundell. David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's essential that our aid is effective in Yemen. So can I ask the Minister what recent discussions he's had with his international counterparts and the UN regarding the recent panel of experts report on Yemen, and whether he'll agree to meet with me and representatives of humanitarian organisations, local NGOs and the Yemeni private sector, whose vital role providing essential food and commodities to Yemenis and supplying the humanitarian operation has been undermined by the serious shortcomings and factual inaccuracies contained within the panel's report.
I thank my right honourable friend for the point he's made today, and also the correspondence that we've exchanged on this very important issue. We are well aware of the allegations made in the panel of experts' most recent report, and they are significant and concerning. We share the panel's vision for the government of Yemen and the Yemen Central Bank to become more accountable. I'm more than happy to ensure that he and I and people more knowledgeable about these issues are able to speak in the near future.
Final question from Zara Sultana. Zara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister began his remarks by saying that improving the situation for Yemenis was, and I quote, a priority for his government. How he can say that with a straight face, I do not know. Not only has he announced a 50% cut in aid to Yemen, but since the Saudi-led war in Yemen began, his government has licensed £6.7 billion worth of arms sales to the Saudis. That's British-made bombs dropped from British-made jets flown by British-trained pilots. So instead of warm words and crocodile tears, will the Minister take necessary action for peace and end arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises this issue on the day after Houthi missiles are sent into civilian areas of Saudi. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia seeks to defend itself against such aggression, as every country in the world has the right to do. Our arms export regime is robust, and the best thing that we can do, as I say, to help the people of Yemen is to encourage all the parties, both within Yemen and regional partners, to bring this conflict to an end.
I'm suspending the House for 2 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Order. I now call the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, to make a statement. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, today marks 12 weeks since Margaret Keenan became the first person in the world to receive a clinically approved vaccine for COVID-19. She's since been joined by over 20 million other citizens of this country in the biggest and the fastest vaccination effort the world has ever seen. This is a phenomenal achievement. Our vaccination programme is a national success story for the whole United Kingdom. And the reasons it matters is because it allows us to replace the protection currently given by restrictions on our freedoms with the protection from science. The data confirms that this strategy is working because the vaccines work. The number of hospital admissions is falling faster than the number of new cases, whereas in the first peak, they fell more slowly. And among the age groups vaccinated first, the fall in hospitalisations is faster than in younger age groups yet to get a jab. Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House some further analysis which backs up this excellent news. The halving time of hospital admissions is now every 18 days. Over the past fortnight, it's fallen from those aged over 85 years of age from 18 days to 15. This morning, the Office for National Statistics published data showing the number of deaths falling by over a quarter a week in mid-February. And more than that, the number of deaths each day is not only falling faster than after the first peak, it's falling faster in the over 80s who got the jab first compared to the under 80s. The number of daily deaths is halving every 12 days, but amongst the over 80s, it's now halving every 10. So while the fall in cases is decelerating, the fall in the number of deaths is accelerating. And Mr. Speaker, what all this shows is that the vaccine is working, reducing the number of deaths among those who were vaccinated first and preventing hospital admissions. This is real-world evidence that the vaccine is protecting the NHS and saving lives, that the 12-week dosing regime is saving lives, and that this country's strategy is working. Mr. Speaker, as well as this real-world data, I'd like to update the House on two new pieces of analytical research published over the last 24 hours. First, this morning, the Office for National Statistics published new data on the levels of protection people have. They show that up to the 11th of February, 1 in 4 people are estimated to have antibodies against coronavirus in England, up from 1 in 5. The levels are highest in the over 80s, the first group to be vaccinated, showing again the protection from the vaccine across the country. The second piece of research, published last night, shows that a single dose of either the Oxford or Pfizer vaccine delivers protection against severe infection in the over 70s, with a more than 80% reduction in hospitalisations. It is great news that both vaccines work so effectively. And in fact, the protection from catching COVID 35 days after the first jab is even slightly better for the Oxford jab than for Pfizer. So people can have confidence that they will get protection whichever jab they're offered. I'm very grateful to the work of colleagues across the House for promoting vaccine take-up, which has helped deliver some of the highest levels of enthusiasm for vaccination in the whole world. And I'm pleased to inform the House that we're now inviting over 60s to be vaccinated too. Although the day-to-day figures of supply are lumpy, we have some bumper weeks ahead later this month. But given that our vaccination programme began 12 weeks ago today, from now we begin in earnest our programme of second vaccinations, which ramps up over the month of March. I can assure the House that we have factored these second jabs into our supply projections, and we're on track to meet our target of offering a vaccine to all priority groups 1 to 9 by the 15th of April and all adults by the end of July. Mr. Speaker, our vaccination programme means we can set out our roadmap to freedom and put this pandemic behind us. But we must stay vigilant, because COVID-19, like all viruses, mutates over time. And part of controlling any virus is responding to new variants as they arise, just as we do with flu each year. Knowing this, we invested in genomic sequencing right at the start of the pandemic, giving the UK one of the biggest genomic sequencing capabilities in the world. And thanks to that, we've been able to spot variants here at home and support others to detect variants in other parts of the world. I'd like to update the House on the 6 cases of the variant of concern that was first identified in Manaus in Brazil that we've now identified here in the UK. We know that 5 of these 6 people quarantined at home as they were legally required to do. We've been in contact with them, and I'd like to put on the record my gratitude to them for doing their duty and following the rules. Whenever we identify cases of a new variant, we respond fast and come down hard by bringing in enhanced sequencing and testing. And so we're stepping up our testing and sequencing in South Gloucestershire as a precaution. We have no information to suggest that the variant has spread further. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, one of these 6 cases completed a test but didn't successfully complete the contact details. Incidents like this are rare and only occur in around 0.1% of tests. I can update the House on the latest information in identifying this case. We've identified the batch of home test kits in question. Our search has narrowed from the whole country down to 379 households in the southeast of England, and we're contacting each one. We're grateful that a number of potential cases have come forward following the call that we put out over the weekend, and I'd like to thank colleagues from across the House who've helped us to get the message out there. And Mr. Speaker, our current vaccines have not yet been studied against this variant, and we're working to understand what impact it might have, but we do know that this variant has caused significant challenges in Brazil. So we're doing all we can to stop the spread of this new variant in the UK, to analyse its effects, and to develop an updated vaccine that works on all these variants of concern and protect the progress that we've made as a nation. Mr. Speaker, this country is on the road to recovery, and we have freedom on the horizon. We must proceed with caution, because although we're moving quickly, the virus moves quickly too. So let's not waver and do whatever it takes to keep this virus under control.
Shadow Secretary of State Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and as always, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. With respect to the Brazilian variant, in January and February, cases here were running at tens of thousands a day. We were in lockdown. We're still in lockdown because of our own homegrown new infectious variant, and yet people were allowed to fly in from abroad, bringing the P1 Brazilian mutation with them. Throughout history, epidemic after epidemic has exploited international travel. Surely it is obvious that tougher border controls should have been in place sooner. I welcome the progress that the Secretary of State has made on identifying the batch, but can he tell us how on earth a test can be processed that doesn't collect the contact details, and what mechanisms will be put in place to fix this in the future? Because £22 billion has been allocated to this system. It feels to me that if somebody has vanished into thin air, can he assure us it won't happen again? I note he said there is no information to suggest wider spread of this variant, but he will recall John Edmonds from SAGE told the Home Affairs Select Committee back in January that for every identified South African variant, there were probably another 30 unidentified. Can he tell us if he has received any estimates on the number of unidentified cases that are in the wider community? Now, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the tremendous progress that has been made, both on vaccination and on driving infection rates down. It is a testament to the NHS and everybody involved in the vaccination programme, and a testament to everybody who is playing their part in this lockdown. But we also know that the virus can quickly rebound. We know that mutations could evade vaccination. We know we're in a race against evolution. So we have a long way to go, because nowhere, to be frank, is COVID safe until everywhere is COVID safe. And none of us want to yo-yo in and out of lockdowns. So can he guarantee that the lockdown easing will absolutely be based on data, not dates, as promised, and that the assessment time between each step isn't compromised? Now, I welcome the extra surge testing, but what is the current time frame for genetic sequencing? How can it be speeded up? Now, overall trends are coming down, that is welcome, but infections in some areas remain stubbornly high. The national average is 100 cases per 100,000. In Leicester, my city, it's one of the highest in the country though. Infection rate is 222 per 100,000. In Ashfield, the infection rate is 246 per 100,000. In Hyndburn, infection rates have increased to 162 per 100,000. In Oadby and Wigston, it's gone up. In Watford, it's gone up. In Worthing, it's gone up. So what steps will be taken to ensure that areas like Ashfield, Leicester, Watford, Worthing, Hyndburn, etc. aren't left behind when the national lockdown restrictions begin to lift? Or will they remain in localised lockdowns? Will the local authorities be given extra resources to do more door-to-door testing and retrospective tracing? And will workplaces in those areas be inspected by the Health and Safety Executive to ensure they are COVID secure? And of course, will people finally be given decent sick pay and isolation support? Now, many areas like Leicester are also facing a double whammy of relatively high infection rates and relatively low vaccination rates. So what further action will now be taken to drive up vaccination rates amongst hesitant communities? Will he fund faith groups, community groups, local public health teams to develop more targeted, tailored local vaccination campaigns? Which comes to tomorrow's budget. So tomorrow's budget can't be about the Chancellor's Instagram account. It has to be about the NHS and social care accounts. So can he guarantee that tomorrow we'll get an increase in the public health allocations to help public health teams plan their local COVID response over the next year? Will our NHS heroes get the pay rise they deserve? And with 224,000 patients waiting over 12 months for treatment, will our NHS get the resources it needs to deliver the patient care that patients and our constituents deserve?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, he's quite right to thank all those who are responsible for the vaccine rollout. It has been an absolutely remarkable effort, and he's right to say that the NHS have played their part, and they have played a central part. But it has been more than the NHS. It has also been the brilliance of the logistics, in particular of our armed services. It's been the volunteers who've come forward in their droves. It's been the regulator and the partnership with private industry. And I think this model of a combination of academic excellence and partnership between government, regulator and private industry is a model on which we can build. I know it's a model that they don't like much on the other side of this House. He says to me he likes it. We always knew that he's misplaced over there. His problem is that sometimes his rhetoric is aimed more at his backbenches than what he thinks is right up here. But I just urge him to listen to his own conscience, and to back us and back the businesses who are making this vaccination rollout happen, and to put that support into practice. He asked about sequencing, again done by a brilliant combination of academics, government and private businesses. We're now sequencing a third of the positive tests in this country. And that means that although that isn't yet a full survey of all the positives, although we're working towards that, it does mean that we are able to spot these variants much more than anywhere else in the world. We currently provide around 40% of the total global sequences of this disease, of this virus. And that is and we're driving up that sequencing capacity. He asked about increasing the uptake of vaccination. He's quite right to, and we are working with faith groups and local directors of public health and others. And councils have got a very important role to play alongside pharmacists and of course GPs in increasing the vaccination uptake. But the vaccination uptake has been very, very high, higher than I expected, and I'm really thrilled about that. He asked finally about making sure that the roadmap follows data, not dates. We have rigorously set out the gap between the steps to ensure that we can see the effect of one step before we take the other. That is with the goal of having this roadmap as a one-way route out of restrictions so that we can all get back to the freedom that we crave.
We now go to the Chair of the Health Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate the Health Secretary on the brilliant progress of the vaccine rollout, which is a personal achievement for him as well as a collective achievement for the government. And also thank him for the transparency in that programme and indeed transparency on the risks of the new Brazilian virus. I'd like to ask him about transparency in another area, which is the new integrated care systems he's planning in his white paper. And the concerns expressed by the Nuffield Trust, the King's Fund, the Health Foundation, NHS providers at this morning's Health Select Committee about the lack of detail on just how the public will know how well their local ICS is doing. Sir Robert Francis told the committee that he favoured asking the CQC to Ofsted rate the new ICSs, and I just wonder whether he thinks that might be a solution to this accountability issue.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And transparency has played a vital role in our approach to responding to this virus, and I think that that is an important lesson from it that should be heeded globally. I think that in terms of the future of the NHS arranged around the ICSs, that transparency will be important too. There will be a crucial role for the CQC, which currently rates hospitals according to as he puts it, an Ofsted-style rating. And I think that it is vital that the CQC has a similar role when it comes to ICSs. And I look forward to working with him and other members of his select committee to make sure we get the details of that right.
Now I have video link to the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While the number of cases with the Brazilian variant is thankfully small, it's a warning that being tested in advance doesn't rule out being a traveller who's carrying COVID. The South African variant is resistant to antibodies from previous COVID patients, and there's concern that both may be resistant to vaccine-induced immunity. They could therefore undermine the success of the vaccination programme. The Brazilian variant has already been identified outside South America, and the South African strain is present in 35 countries that aren't on the red list. The arrival of this Brazilian strain via both Switzerland and Paris demonstrates the various routes to the UK from high-risk countries and how a traveller could avoid the current hotel quarantine system by separating out the legs of their journey. Those infected spent several hours in close quarters with other travellers who even now would not be subject to hotel quarantine. I assume the government is tracing the passengers from these flights, but with genomics taking some time, there is a significant window for concerning variants to get a foothold in the UK before they're discovered. This situation wouldn't have arisen with comprehensive hotel quarantine as advised by SAGE. So why did the Secretary of State agree to such an inadequate system? And can he tell us the view of the Joint Biosecurity Committee? Does he recognise that quarantining just 1% of international arrivals does not protect the UK from these variants, nor those which may evolve in the future in other parts of the world? So will the government now review their hotel quarantine policy and make it fit for purpose?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady is completely wrong, and she knows it. There is a quarantine in place for 100% of arrivals as passengers in this country. And in fact, this episode, in which all those we've successfully contacted, all 5, have fully isolated and quarantined at home as required, demonstrates that policy working. Now, we have further strengthened it and introduced hotel quarantine, and that will no doubt give further reassurance. But the characterisation that she gives out is wrong, and some of the description of the organisations involved is wrong as well. I'm very happy to ensure she gets a private briefing so that she can understand the situation in future.
Now I have a video link to Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I congratulate my right honourable friend for the rollout of the vaccine and for the use of the sure screen tests which are brought local to me. The pressure on the NHS due to coronavirus has caused the cancellation of thousands of elective operations. can my right honourable friend inform me what plans he has to ensure that hospitals catch up on cancer diagnosis and care and cardiothoracic diagnosis and surgeries, and how fast he expects to progress this?
Thank you very much. My honourable friend makes two critical points. The first is that the manufacture and the purchasing of British-made tests is an incredibly important project. And I want to thank Screen in her constituency, who have worked very closely with us over a number of months to get a product that we can all be very, very proud of, made in Britain, to test people in Britain to help break the chains of transmission and control this virus. And I'm very grateful for her personal work in that regard. I also agree on the importance of the second point that she makes. In the spending review, £1 billion was put aside for the recovery of elective operations, as well as £500 million for recovery of mental health services. And this is absolutely crucial in cancer and all of the different elective areas, including cardiothoracic, as she set out. We'll be publishing further details of this recovery programme soon. At the moment, the NHS is just exiting a stage of very, very significant pressure. There are still over 10,000 people in hospitals with COVID, so there's still significant pressure, and we need to make sure that the staff and the team get some R&R, but then the next year will be all about that recovery that she talks about. The money's been allocated, and then we need to get on with it.
We now go to the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Brazil variant cases arrived a month after I raised this issue with the Prime Minister, and they show the problems from delays, but also the limitations of the pre-travel tests that didn't catch these cases. Even now, 99% of the 15,000 daily arrivals are not covered by hotel quarantine, and most people can still travel home from the airport by tube, train, or even plane, mixing with others, as some of these travellers did, without being tested on arrival in the UK. So why is the government still refusing to introduce additional tests on arrival and still allowing international passengers to travel onwards on UK public transport? Does he not recognise that these gaps in the system will let more new variant cases spread?
These cases would be caught by the new hotel quarantine policy. When she talks about the need for more testing, we've introduced tests on day 2 and day 8 to make sure that we can keep everybody who arrives as a passenger into the UK under the necessary level of surveillance.
Video link to Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will be well aware that my constituency is an extremely diverse constituency in terms of its racial and religious makeup. And also our National Health Service staff have done a brilliant job on keeping up the fantastic vaccination rate during this period. However, we are still having to combat the anti-vax type propaganda that's going out. So what action is my right honourable friend going to take to ensure that people get the truth about the wisdom of taking the vaccine, regardless of what race, religion or cultural background you come from?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's an incredibly important question, and I pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend has done in getting this message out there. And in Harrow, we're vaccinating in mosques, we're vaccinating in temples, we're vaccinating in GP surgeries, and it is a critical part of the rollout to ensure the message gets to everybody that this vaccine is safe and it works. And it's no good just me saying that, but we want to and we are engaging leaders of all communities, faith leaders, of people who have strong voices in their communities, and critically ensuring that people feel as much as possible that the vaccination effort is accessible to them. It is on us to make sure that the vaccines are easy to get hold of and that people get answers to any reasonable questions that they may have. And I look forward to working with him further on delivering this across Harrow and the whole of the country.
Video link to Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will agree with me that every hour is vital in tracking down new positive cases, particularly new cases of new variants. So could the Secretary of State explain why it is that the eye-watering £22 billion that has been spent on the test and trace system, that it doesn't track each and every test that is sent out based on the unique code on every test? Surely this would help close in the net on positive tests much quicker than the public calls for help we've seen over the last few days, when that vital information is missing when each test is returned.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure you were in the chair when I addressed this precise question in my statement. This not having the contact details happens in about 0.1% of tests. In this case, we think that the test was done as part of a home test kit, where obviously it is incumbent on the individual to set out those details, because home test kit can be both sent to your home, in which case of course we have the details of where it was sent, or in response to surges they can be taken round by the local authority teams and dropped off. And therefore, we need to find out exactly where this one was dropped off. But as what she omitted to say is that the team have done a very, very good job of narrowing down to 379 households where this may be. The call out at the weekend has been answered with a number of leads, and we're working hard to make sure that we can find the individual concerned.
Video link to Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, both the scientific news and the progress of our vaccine rollout that suggests we're well on the way to getting back to normal. In particular, I was delighted to learn about the fantastic new data showing both the Oxford and Pfizer vaccines are effective in hugely reducing hospitalisations and deaths from COVID. And indeed that the Oxford jab, which is being manufactured here in Newcastle-under-Lyme, may even be the more effective of the two. So will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming that our European neighbours, like France, have recognised this fact and are moving to now allow this terrific vaccine to protect the lives of older people there, just as it has done in the UK?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to see any country recognise the life-saving value of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, as we recognise the life-saving value of all that have passed assessment by our regulator, the MHRA. And this vaccine, we know, is not only safe, but it is saving lives and stopping hospitalisations right across this country right now. And I pay tribute to the scientists behind it who have done so much work to get it to this place. And it is simply fantastic to see in the data with the naked eye that these vaccines are saving lives.
Video link, Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also congratulate the Secretary of State for having the temerity and the leadership to identify early on that the vaccination and getting a good vaccine was the way ahead. And here we are, very much leading the way for not only Europe, but indeed for the world. And indeed, a few weeks ago, the Irish government themselves and Europe tried to actually steal vaccines out of the arms of people in Northern Ireland because they were so jealous of how good the United Kingdom was doing. With that in mind, can the Secretary of State let us know what he's going to do whenever, by probably late summer, we've got 8 times the amount of vaccines the United Kingdom will actually need? Is there a list being compiled of those needy countries where the United Kingdom can help and assist those people in those countries with vaccination?
Secretary of State.
Yes, absolutely. Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst I am so proud of the work that we've done in this UK, in this United Kingdom, to both develop the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and also to buy vaccines from around the world that are safe and effective and be able to vaccinate everybody here at home, I'm also absolutely cognizant of the fact that vaccination around the world will be necessary. I was very pleased to see that COVAX has started vaccinated in Ghana last week, And while we do currently look as if we may have excess vaccines in the future, we have clearly committed that we will make them available around the world. Now, we know for sure that we seek to vaccinate with 2 doses every adult in the UK. There may well be a need for a 3rd vaccination over the autumn against variants, and there is currently a clinical trial considering the vaccination of under 18s. So the exact number of vaccines that we will need for the UK population is not yet known, but we are absolutely keen to ensure that we then go on to support with vaccines, as well as with money that we have already pledged, support the vaccination of the most underdeveloped parts of the world.
Video link to Mark Pawsey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State knows how well the vaccination programme is going here in Warwickshire, and may I tell him that his remarks in Friday's national briefing were greatly appreciated here. Many of the residents being vaccinated at Lock House in Rugby have asked me about the road back to normality, and some about getting some sun on a foreign holiday. So I wonder if he could say something about any plans the government may be considering for people wishing to travel both home and abroad to be able to demonstrate that they've received their vaccination through some form of certification.
Secretary of State.
Well, Coventry and Warwickshire have done an amazing job, and I was very, very pleased to see them top the ranks that were published on Thursday of the areas of England that have vaccinated the most. And so my congratulations to him and his team. The answer on foreign holidays is that we said in the roadmap that international holidays will not be allowed before the 17th of May. And we're working with the Global Travel Task Force, which in fact met this lunchtime just before I came to the House. It's chaired by my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary. I'm on it along with Home Office and Foreign Office colleagues, and the travel industry, the airlines, cruise ships and others from across the travel industry. That will report by the 12th of April. Now, the challenge is that whilst last year international travel restrictions were about restricting the number of cases due to high prevalence elsewhere when the prevalence here was low, we also now have to take into consideration the risks from variants of concern, and therefore more understanding about the impact of vaccines on variants of concern, like the variant first discovered in Manaus in Brazil that we were talking about earlier. More information about that is critical to answering the question of when we'll be able safely to reopen international travel.
Video link to Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I received some welcome news this morning that Lambeth's local COVID vaccination team is one of the highest performing teams in the country. Our local CCG reports that 85% of people over 75 have now been vaccinated, and 89% of residents in care homes. And here in Vauxhall, we've had to implement the surge testing operation in the past few days because of the case of the South African variant that was discovered locally. This is all down to the tireless efforts of our primary care workers, our nurses, GPs, pharmacies, along with an army of volunteers. But I'm concerned that despite this heroic effort, there is still some misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that more needs to be done to counter this misinformation and support vaccine roll-up and take-up amongst our BME communities?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I do, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to add one to the long list of people who the Honourable Lady rightly thanked in Lambeth for the incredible work of getting take-up as high as 85% amongst the over 75s. And that's her. She has played a personal leadership role, and I thank her for that and pay tribute to it. There is still a lot of work still to do, and I hope that we can keep working together on it.
Video link to Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The pace and scale of the vaccination programme has been incredible, and we owe a debt of thanks to everyone involved. In Wolverhampton, we've kept pace by using a variety of locations, including our leisure and community centres. As we all look forward to restrictions ending, I hope these public buildings will be returned for leisure and community use. For how long does the Secretary of State predict we will need a mass vaccination programme, and with the potential need for a rolling programme of booster injections or vaccinations against new variants, what infrastructure is being planned so we can protect our entire population for as long as is necessary without overburdening our NHS?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend raises a very important point. Free the leisure centres. They are being used, many of them are being used as vaccination centres now, but I like her, look forward to the day when they can be used for the purpose they were built, as leisure centres. And so it is important that should we need a continued vaccination programme, for instance, over the summer and into the autumn, as seems likely, that we will have to move to more permanent places or places that are free to be used as vaccination centres over that period. In fact, that has already started to happen. We've already started to move some of our both testing and vaccination centres to more semi-permanent sites to free up the original sites that we often started with because we needed things to move incredibly quickly. So that is an important consideration. It is frankly best done as close to the local area as possible. So it's best that I don't get involved in each individual one. I'm absolutely certain that the NHS in Wolverhampton is far better placed to make these sorts of decisions than I am from this dispatch box, Madam Deputy Speaker. But I hope that they'd keep my honourable friend informed.
Video link to Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid data, not dates, clearly hasn't worked because people have quite understandably just focused on the dates. And the spring sunshine at the weekend meant that in lovely places like Cambridge, it was very, very busy. So is the government now going to make a precautionary adjustment, or with hospital numbers still so high, take a chance and risk running the NHS into the ground?
Secretary of State.
No.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Given that we believe in people taking responsibility for their own actions, will my right honourable friend confirm that the refusal of a minority to accept vaccination is no reason to delay the lifting of restrictions on society as a whole?
Secretary of State.
I think this is an important point. We do not have mandatory vaccinations in this country. We do encourage as much uptake as possible, but with uptake levels well into the 90s amongst those groups who've been offered, it is clear that we will be able to get very, very high levels of coverage and therefore lift restrictions, and I hope that we'll be able to lift restrictions on the basis of the dates in the timetable set out. But as per my answer earlier, we will also monitor the data of the impact in between each one.
Video link, Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Anita Barker, the head teacher of Scott Primary in Bedford, is doing all she can to keep her school safe and open. But she knows more can be done and wants her staff to be vaccinated. I understand the JCVI's reasoning on priority, but we have already made a special case for our schools. The whole success of the roadmap hinges on schools going back safely. So does the Secretary of State have political will to do all he can to prevent further school closures? And does he recognize that means vaccinating school staff as soon as possible?
Deputy Speaker, I'm very, very happy to ensure that as much as possible, school staff are vaccinated whenever they possibly can be within the JCVI categorisations. But we do have to follow the clinical advice on this because there is no evidence of teachers being worse affected by COVID than other professions. And I think it's incumbent on us all to ensure that the message gets across that this order, this prioritisation, the order of the queue, so to speak, is based on the best clinical advice as to how to save most lives most quickly. And I'm sure that's something in which everybody wants to share.
Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I again congratulate my right honourable friend on the 20 million milestone? It is a fantastic achievement for everybody involved. But could I probe him on the question of outdoor transmission? It's been quite clear in the last few days that the level of adherence to the rules has dropped in outdoor settings. Has his research shown that there is genuinely an issue around the transmission of the virus outdoors? And have we actually seen any significant incidents of widespread transmission in outdoor settings?
The clinical advice on this is that outdoors is safer than indoors. That the likelihood of transmission outdoors is much lower, but particularly in crowded outdoor areas, it is not nil. And so, hence, the roadmap is based on opening up outdoors sooner, but people should still follow social distancing and, of course, should follow the rules. But it does mean that come the 29th of this month, we are able to make that step in terms of opening up outdoors first.
Video link, Martin Day.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Scottish Health Protection teams are having to trace all the people who travelled on the plane to Aberdeen. And there must be similar risks and concerns in England given the travel through London. Of course, there are no passenger lists for anyone who had onbound travel by train. So does the Minister not agree, therefore, with me that it's a matter of urgency that his government changes policy to reduce the risk of importing further and more dangerous variants?
Secretary of State.
Well, of course, since these the six under discussion with the variant of concern first found in Brazil travelled here, since they travelled here, we have introduced further strengthening at the border, the hotel quarantine, and I think the best approach here would be a UK-wide one. I discussed that with my colleagues in the devolved administrations, and I think it would be. I look forward to a time when we're able to have an aligned policy.
Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The constituency data released by Public Health England last Friday showed that over 30,000 people in Harrogate and Esborough had had their first dose of the vaccine. Now, this is fantastic local performance, alongside the stunning national performance, reflects the expertise, determination and teamwork of many people, and I'd like to put on record my gratitude to them. Can my right honourable friend confirm that we're on track to give everyone their second dose of the vaccine within 12 weeks of the first?
Secretary of State.
Yes, we have the vaccines available, and local areas need to know that the vaccines will be delivered to them in order for them to meet their scheduled commitments for those second jabs. The logistics of the second jab is actually slightly more complicated than the first jab, because you need to make sure that the right person gets the right vaccine at the right date. And so there's a huge amount of work underway as that programme starts, today being 12 weeks to the day since the vaccination programme as a whole started. So that work is underway. But can I just put on the record, Madam Deputy Speaker, my thanks to the team in Harrogate who've done an amazing job vaccinating over 30,000 people, more than the national average, if my memory serves me correctly. And can I thank my honourable friend for his leadership in Harrogate, for supporting the team there to make this happen.
Video link to Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The rollout of the vaccines by the NHS and the efficacy of the vaccines is to be celebrated, and I congratulate everybody involved. However, the UK has the highest mortality rate per capita of any major country. Given that the government maintains that it has consistently followed expert scientific advice, how soon does the Secretary of State think we should review that scientific advice and the decisions of the government that were based upon that advice, so that we can learn the lessons of the past year as soon as possible?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're constantly learning. The asymptomatic transmission of this virus. We're constantly learning about the way that it mutates, about what works effectively against it, and then we update policy according to what we learn. The nature of science is a matter of constantly learning against as new facts come to bear, and you don't wait until after a pandemic to learn. You learn all the way through it.
Video link to Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend on the pace of the vaccine rollout and welcome the good news about the sharp decline in hospital admissions and deaths amongst vaccinated groups. Does he agree with me that this provides real hope that we will be able to end social distancing along with other restrictions from the 21st of June?
Secretary of State.
Yes.
Video link, Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Secretary of State shares my concern that not every community is as confident as others about taking up the vaccine, and that is why I know he will want to congratulate my local doctors and PCN networks and the local church leaders in Walthamstow who led a vaccine clinic last week in our community to help support the Black and ethnic minority residents to take up the vaccine. He will also want to congratulate my doctors on being one of the highest performers in terms of getting people to have their vaccine in the country. Will he meet with me to discuss what we can learn about this community-led approach to vaccination and how we can do more to help them in the outreach work to bridge that gap between different communities in our country so that nobody is left behind in this health challenge?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I think this is one of the Honourable Lady's campaigns that we can all get behind. She's quite right to raise the work that's being done in Walthamstow, which is very impressive. And I'll arrange a meeting between her and Minister Zahawi, the vaccine rollout minister, to see what we can learn and see what we can replicate.
Sir Edward Lee.
I received an email from a lady this morning who's extremely clinically vulnerable, and she, for perfectly good medical reasons, can't receive a flu jab or a COVID jab. So she's very concerned she won't be able to leave her front door if we bring in COVID passports. So for reasons of civil liberties, will the Secretary of State make absolutely clear that we're not interested in bringing in COVID passports internally? But they are useful for foreign travel. And I say to the shadow spokesman that with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps we should have introduced a hotel quarantine system much sooner. But can the Secretary of State make clear that he will resist the travel lobby, will absolutely upfront and be honest with people and say it's very unwise to book summer holidays now. There may be these mutants. It's better just to hold off. I think people accept the government being tough as long as the government is consistent, particularly on foreign travel.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. If I address each of his questions in turn, Madam Deputy Speaker. The point about certification is an important one. And whilst the decisions on certification are being currently reviewed in a review led by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, it is clear that we will need to provide people the ability to certify whether they've had the jab, and we will need to absolutely take into consideration those who have a certified clinical reason why they can't have the jab, which does apply to a relatively small number of people, but it is an important consideration that will be taken forward as part of that work. When he comes to, I'm grateful for him expressing his views on the approach to international travel. What I can tell him is that there is quarantine required for everybody who arrives as a passenger to this country, as well as testing on day 2 and day 8. And that means that we have a robust procedure to ensure that cases cannot be brought into this country and then spread in the community.
Video link to Ben Bradshaw.
With COVID rates in Devon now down to just 31 per 100,000, and with all the vulnerable groups due to have been vaccinated by the end of this month, what will be the justification for keeping my constituents locked down and local businesses closed through Easter and beyond because rates somewhere else happen to be higher?
Secretary of State.
We obviously had a tiered system over the autumn. One of the challenges we found was people travelling from a part of the country where rates are higher to those where they are lower. So whilst we don't rule out a localised approach to outbreaks, we are going to move down the roadmap as a nation across England.
Sir Christopher Chope.
Madam Deputy Speaker, people understand figures more than percentages. So can I ask my right honourable friend, how many people have been admitted to hospital who have already had a vaccine for at least 3 weeks in England? Because that figure will illustrate to people the risk assessment that they would like to be able to make in respect of this particular set of vaccines, in the same way as I've been told that flu vaccines are only 40% efficient. These seem to be at least 80%, which is really good news.
Secretary of State.
These I don't have the figures to hand specifically, but the MHRA, the regulator, regularly publishes what are called these adverse events when somebody still has a problem with coronavirus, having had the vaccine, or a response to the vaccine. And I will ensure that whether MHRA or Public Health England, the appropriate body, publishes both in terms of number and in terms of percentage.
Video link to Hywel Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The COVID testing package reservation form for international travellers from red list countries into England requires proof of purchase of 2 COVID-19 tests before they can travel on to England and to Scotland. However, there is no reference to Wales on the form. Can the Secretary of State assure me that this is an oversight which will be remedied immediately, and that international travellers from England continuing on to Wales are indeed required to comply with the testing and quarantine rules?
Secretary of State.
Yes, all international passengers are required to comply with the rules, and I will write to the honourable gentleman to set out either why the system is is done in that way, or to tell him that it's been rectified if that's what's needed. It's the first time I've heard of that particular issue.
Steve Brine.
The roadmap contains a chapter on building resilience to future pandemics, which I think we have to be honest and say are not going to leave us alone for another 100 years. So with respect to the global network of zoonotic research hubs, which the Prime Minister wisely set out in his 5-point plan of the UN last September, can we make sure these build on the work of experienced virus hunters already out there, organisations like the Global Health Network, who have years of experience searching for unseen viruses that leap from animals to humans?
Secretary of State.
Yes, the proposed work, as set out by the Prime Minister at the UN General Assembly, which we're working on as president with our presidency of the G7, aims precisely to build on and strengthen the existing work that has been underway, but clearly we need to ensure that all of the future risks, whether they're from zoonotic diseases or due to environmental changes that lead to risks to human health, all these things need to be taken into account, and we need to have an early warning system that is as effective as possible.
Video link to Jamie Stone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This very afternoon, I am going to get a JAG. I point out that the JAG is a Scottish term for a vaccination, not a posh car. Getting the maximum number of people in the Highlands vaccinated as fast as possible is crucial for the reopening of businesses in my constituency, including those in hospitality and tourism. Can I ask the Secretary of State to please give the maximum encouragement to the Scottish Government to make sure that this happens?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the vaccination programme is a successful UK-wide programme. We work very closely with the Scottish NHS and indeed the Scottish Government to make sure that right across all of these islands we have the vaccination available fairly, according to clinical need, as fast as we possibly can. And we can deliver this because we are one United Kingdom, with the buying power and the scientific capability that comes from being one United Kingdom, all working together. This simply wouldn't be possible if there were the separation that some propose, and I will do everything I possibly can to ensure that businesses across Scotland, that residents in Scotland, get the protection from the jab that they deserve at an equal pace to everywhere else in this country. It is an absolutely crucial part of getting all of us on the road to recovery.
Sir Desmond Swain.
In order that we get and keep herd immunity, is my right honourable friend planning any hard-hitting public information campaigns to ensure that younger adults take up the vaccine with the level of enthusiasm that my relatively elderly constituents have done?
Secretary of State.
Yes, we are absolutely planning to instil as much enthusiasm as we can muster amongst younger people, as we've seen amongst older people. And the message to anybody who is at the younger end of the age spectrum is that getting a jab helps to set us all free and back on the road to recovery. It helps protect you, including from long COVID, which can be a debilitating condition, and it helps protect all of us. It is the right thing to do.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for an incredible record-breaking vaccine rollout? We're all incredibly impressed. The wonderful results showing that even one dose of vaccination reduces the chance of hospital admissions by 80%. Would or could the Secretary of State outline the rationale for not looking at having all frontline services vaccinated, rather, and as an example, seeing a 61-year-old writer who is able to work from home receiving a vaccination before a 59-year-old shop worker who is face-to-face with hundreds of different people each day? And should the Secretary of State and Government not consider these thousands of frontline workers who have made the continuance of life possible during these very difficult times? Thank you.
Well, we did consider this question and asked our clinical advisors, the JCVI, to look into this question, and they found that notwithstanding the different risks that different occupations face, the overriding determinant of risk is age, and therefore we're proceeding on the basis of that advice across the UK.
Video link to Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over 40% of the adult population of my Colne Valley constituency have now received a vaccination, a truly magnificent effort. But across Kirklees, though, there has been an uptick in COVID cases last week. What message can the Health Secretary send to my constituents so that we can stay on track with the roadmap out of lockdown?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for asking this question, because we have seen in a minority of areas a small increase in the number of cases, and it does include Kirklees. And we've seen this in around just under 1 in 5 local authority areas. And my message to everybody in Kirklees is that this isn't over yet. We have a roadmap out, but it isn't a roadmap for government alone. It's a roadmap for all of us to walk down together. And that means following the rules, and that means for now, stay at home. But by doing that, we can all then move on the dates that are set out. And instead of not before dates, they will become the dates that we can make the next step. But it is on all of us, and so I'd urge everybody to continue. I know it's been a difficult winter, and I know the sun is starting to shine a bit brighter, but we must all stick at this. We can see the way out, and I hope that we can get there together.
Final question is a video link to Mari Rimmer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, over 3,000 clinically vulnerable people in cohort 6 are going to have their vaccinations cancelled in St Helens at the end of this week. This is unless the required supplies are delivered by Thursday lunchtime. The vaccine site is serving 4 primary care networks, yet the national supply team is only recognising and supplying 1 network. The mutual aid gathered to cover the shortfall in the past is no longer available. Will the Secretary of State please urgently intervene to address this misunderstanding so that no vaccinations are cancelled?
Secretary of State.
I'll absolutely ensure that the Minister for Vaccine Rollout gets in contact directly with the Honourable Lady. This is a massive effort, and so there may be logistical challenges. We'll look and understand what the situation is in St Helens. As I have some family in St Helens, I'm pretty keen to make sure this gets sorted ASAP, Madam Deputy Speaker. But it just shows that it isn't easy to do this, and the team are working incredibly hard to resolve issues like the one that the Honourable Lady rightly raised all the time to make sure that this can go as smoothly as possible.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and suspend the House for 3 minutes to make necessary arrangements for the next business.